15 Slave Laws. Introduction. Telling a story about living the 15 slave laws and why we won't go back to the terrible treatments to a human. In the antebellum South, slaves were subjected to horrific conditions and inhumane laws. These laws stripped away basic human rights, dignity, and freedom. From prohibitions on education to cruel punishments, the slave codes were designed to maintain absolute control. Today, we remember this dark history not to dwell in pain, but to ensure such injustice never happens again. We stand united, voices raised, declaring we won't go back. Our strength lies in our unity, our power in our shared humanity. Let's move forward, building a world of equality, respect, and opportunity for all.
As the abolitionist movement gained traction, many Southern states passed anti-manumission laws to restrict or prohibit the freeing of slaves. These laws were designed to prevent an increase in the population of free African Americans, which was seen as a threat to the social order of slaveholding states. Some key aspects of these laws included outright bans. Some states completely prohibited the manumission of slaves. Legislative approval. Other states required legislative approval for each individual manumission. Age restrictions. Some laws prohibited the freeing of very young or elderly slaves. Financial requirements. Certain states required slaveholders to provide financial security for freed slaves. Immediate removal. Some laws mandated that freed slaves leave the state immediately upon manumission. These anti-manumission laws reflected the growing tensions between abolitionists and pro-slavery factions, ultimately contributing to the conflicts that led to the Civil War. Manumission laws were statutes that governed the process of freeing enslaved individuals in the United States. These laws varied by state and often changed over time, reflecting the complex and evolving nature of slavery in America. Some key aspects of manumission laws included legal process. Slaveholders had to follow specific legal procedures to free their slaves. Age and health restrictions. Some states required freed slaves to be of a certain age or health condition. Residency requirements. Freed slaves were sometimes required to leave the state within a specified time period. Financial obligations. In some cases, slaveholders had to prove they could financially support freed slaves. State approval. Some states required government approval for manumission, making the process more difficult. Despite these laws, manumission remained a limited practice, with most enslaved individuals gaining freedom through other means such as escape or emancipation proclamations. Slave codes were state laws governing the treatment of enslaved people. They outlined what slaves and slaveholders could and couldn't do. Some key aspects included movement restrictions. Slaves were often forbidden from leaving their master's property without permission. Prohibition on education. It was illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write in many Southern states, as literacy was seen as a threat to the institution of slavery. Curfews. Slaves were required to be off the streets and on their master's property by a certain time. No legal rights. Slaves were considered property and could not legally marry, own property, or enter into contracts. Fugitive slave laws were among the most notorious slave laws in the United States. Enacted in 1793 and strengthened in 1850, these federal statutes required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even if they had reached free states. The laws allowed slave catchers to pursue and capture fugitive slaves across state lines, often leading to the kidnapping of free black people. These laws not only perpetuated the institution of slavery, but also heightened tensions between free and slave states, contributing to the growing divide that would ultimately lead to the Civil War. Slave codes were state laws governing the treatment of enslaved people. They outlined what slaves and slaveholders could and couldn't do. Some key aspects included movement restrictions. Slaves were often forbidden from leaving their master's property without permission. Prohibition on education. It was illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write in many Southern states, as literacy was seen as a threat to the institution of slavery. Curfews. Slaves were required to be off the streets and on their master's property by a certain time. No legal rights. Slaves were considered property and could not legally marry, own property, or enter into contracts. Stay tuned to learn more about the slave laws.
Some states, cruel laws regulated the breeding of slaves. These laws stripped away fundamental human rights, perpetuating the cycle of slavery. Children born to enslaved women automatically became slaves, regardless of the father's status. This brutal system ensured the continuation of slavery across generations. The law callously declared that the status of the child follows that of the mother, reducing human beings to mere property. This inhumane practice tore families apart and denied basic freedoms, showcasing the depths of cruelty in the institution of slavery.
Slave marriage laws. While slaves were generally not allowed to legally marry, some states had informal rules about how relationships between enslaved people should be handled. However, these unions had no legal standing and could be broken at the master's whim. Laws on slave revolts. These laws prescribed severe penalties for slaves and free African Americans who participated in or incited rebellions. Punishments included death, whipping, or other brutal forms of repression. These laws and the other laws preceding this video created a highly regulated system of control, subjugation, and exploitation of enslaved people, ensuring the perpetuation of the institution of slavery until its abolition in 1865. Each state, particularly in the South, had variations on these themes depending on local economies, demographics, and political pressure. My channel needs your help. Please subscribe and push that like button. Stay tuned for more. Hiring outlaws allowed masters to hire out their slaves to others for labor. These laws regulated how such arrangements were to be made and provided that masters would receive the slaves' wages. This practice was common in urban areas, where skilled slaves could be rented out for various tasks. The laws ensured that even when working for others, slaves remained the property of their masters, with all earnings going to the owner. This system allowed slave owners to profit from their slaves' labor, even when they had no immediate use for them, further entrenching the economic incentives of slavery. Laws on slave punishment allowed masters to punish slaves for infractions, often with extreme physical violence. While some states had minimal protections against excessive cruelty, these were rarely enforced. These laws were a crucial part of the slave system, designed to maintain control and submission. Masters had wide latitude in administering punishments, which could include whipping, branding, and other forms of physical abuse. Some states placed limits on punishments, such as prohibiting the killing of slaves, but these regulations were often ignored or loosely interpreted. The lack of enforcement meant that slaves had little recourse against brutal treatment, further emphasizing their lack of legal personhood and reinforcing the power dynamics of the slave system. Enacted laws governing the importation, sale, and trade of slaves. These laws often regulated how slaves could be bought, sold, and transported between states. The slave trade laws were a crucial component of the broader system of slave laws in the United States, designed to maintain and perpetuate the institution of slavery. These regulations covered various aspects of the slave trade, from international importation to domestic transactions. They often specified the conditions under which slaves could be bought and sold, including age restrictions, health requirements, and documentation needed. The laws also governed the transportation of slaves between states, often requiring specific paperwork or permits. These regulations not only facilitated the economic aspects of slavery, but also reinforced the dehumanizing notion of slaves as property to be traded. Laws in many states forbade slaves from gathering in large groups without white supervision, in an effort to prevent rebellions or the sharing of information that could threaten the institution of slavery. This prohibition on slave assembly was a crucial component of the slave laws in the United States, designed to maintain control over the enslaved population. By limiting their ability to congregate, slave owners sought to prevent the formation of communities, the exchange of ideas, and the planning of potential uprisings. This law not only restricted the physical freedom of slaves, but also aimed to suppress their cultural practices, religious gatherings, and any form of organized resistance. The enforcement of these laws further reinforced the power dynamics of the slave system, isolating individuals and preventing the development of strong social bonds within the slave community. In many states, enslaved people were prohibited from testifying in court, especially against white individuals. This meant that slaves had virtually no legal recourse to address abuse or injustice. The prohibition on slave testimony was a critical component of the slave laws in the United States, designed to reinforce the institution of slavery and maintain the power imbalance between slaves and their owners. This law effectively silenced slaves, denying them the ability to speak out against mistreatment or defend themselves in legal proceedings. It created a system where slaves were not only property, but also voiceless in the eyes of the law, further cementing their status as non-persons and perpetuating the cycle of abuse and injustice inherent in the slave system. After the Civil War and emancipation, Southern states enacted black codes designed to restrict the freedom of former slaves. These laws limited African Americans' rights to work, move freely, and own property. They required former slaves to sign labor contracts that closely resembled the conditions of slavery, effectively reimposing control over the newly freed population. Black codes varied by state but generally included vagrancy laws, apprenticeship requirements, and restrictions on property ownership. These oppressive measures sought to maintain the racial hierarchy and economic exploitation of the antebellum era, despite the formal abolition of slavery. The Black Codes laid the groundwork for the later, more comprehensive Jim Crow laws, extending the struggle for true equality well beyond the end of the Civil War. Slave patrol laws were a crucial component of the slave laws in the United States. These laws authorized local militias or patrols to search for runaway slaves, break up any gatherings of slaves without white supervision, and enforce curfews. The patrols were essentially designed to maintain control over the enslaved population. These laws gave patrollers broad powers to stop, search, and punish enslaved individuals found outside their plantations without proper documentation. Slave patrols also had the authority to enter slave quarters on plantations to search for weapons or evidence of planned rebellions. The enforcement of these laws often led to violence and further oppression of the enslaved population, contributing to the climate of fear and control that characterized the institution of slavery in the United States. Laws on slave revolts prescribed severe penalties for slaves and free African Americans who participated in or incited rebellions. Punishments included death, whipping, or other brutal forms of repression. The brutality inflicted was inescapable, leaving no way out for the enslaved. Let me tell you about John, a slave who dared to dream of freedom. Caught planning an escape, he faced the full force of these merciless laws. The crack of the whip echoed as John's back was torn open, each lash a reminder of the system's cruelty. His agonized cries went unheard, his humanity denied. John's story is just one of countless tales of horror endured by those trapped in the barbaric institution of slavery.